She had held his hand through the worst night of his life. She had learned the specific sound of his breathing when the pain was manageable and when it was not. She had been the last voice he heard before he went under for surgery and the first face he saw when he came back out. And when he finally walked out of that hospital on his own 2 feet, he looked at her and said 4 words that she would spend the next 18 months trying to decide whether to believe. I am not leaving. 3 months later, his mother called Isabella Cross for the first time. The call lasted 40 seconds. And at the end of it, Margaret Cole said, in the warm and absolute tone of a woman who considers every conversation already decided, I think we both know, dear, that you are not what our family needs. This is the story of Isabella Cross. And it begins in an Atlanta hospital room at 2 in the morning, when a man who was broken in more ways than the doctors could see opened his eyes and found someone who was not afraid of any of it. This is also the story of what it costs to love someone whose family has spent 3 generations deciding who is and is not worthy of their name. It is the story of a woman who gave everything and was told it was not enough. And it is the story of what happens when a person who knows their own worth refuses, quietly, completely, without drama or performance, to pretend otherwise. Stay with this story, because the ending is not the one anyone expected, and it will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Before we go any further, take a moment right now and let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because on this channel, every story we tell is the kind that finds you at exactly the right moment. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to East Atlanta, Georgia, to a neighborhood called Kirkwood, where Isabella Cross grew up in a 3-bedroom brick house with her mother and her father Raymond, and a porch that faced east so that every morning the sun came through the front windows first, and her mother always said that a house that catches the morning light is a house that knows which direction it is going. Isabella's mother, Rosa, was a seamstress. She worked from a room at the back of the house with a Singer sewing machine and the particular focused quiet of someone who understands that the details are never small, that a seam left unfinished will show itself eventually, and that the work you do when no one is watching is the most important work of all. Her father Raymond taught 6th grade English at Carver Middle School for 31 years. He was the kind of teacher whose students came back to visit him a decade after graduation, not because they had to, but because he had told them something true at the right moment, and they had carried it ever since. He had told Isabella, on the night before she started nursing school, something she would return to for the rest of her life. People who are suffering will tell you everything about themselves if you are quiet enough to hear it. You do not have to be the loudest person in the room to be the most important one. She had written it on a piece of paper and taped it to the inside of her locker. She kept it there for 10 years. Isabella Cross became a registered nurse at 24. She joined the staff of Piedmont Atlanta Hospital, and she was, by every measure that her supervisors used, and several they had not thought to use before her, extraordinary at her work. She was the nurse other nurses called when the situation was difficult, not because she was the most experienced, though she became that too, but because she had a quality that could not be taught and was rarely seen. She could be completely present with another person's pain without being destroyed by it. She could sit beside a patient in the worst moment of their life and make them feel, without false comfort and without performed reassurance, that they were not alone in it. That someone was there, really there, not performing presence, but actually present, in the full and attending way that most people never experience and almost everyone desperately needs. She was 32 years old when Nathaniel Cole arrived at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital on a Tuesday morning in October with multiple fractures, a punctured lung, and the particular stillness of a man who has just been reminded that the body he has been living in for 41 years is considerably more fragile than he had been allowing himself to believe. She was assigned to his care on his 3rd day in the intensive care unit. Neither of them knew, in those first hours, what that assignment would eventually cost them both. Nathaniel Cole was not a man who asked for help easily. This is not unusual in men of 41 who have built something from nothing and have learned, through the specific education of ambition and responsibility, that asking for help is indistinguishable from admitting vulnerability, and that vulnerability, in the world he had grown up navigating, was something to be managed rather than expressed. He had built Cole architecture from a single drafting table in a rented room in Buckhead into a firm with 23 employees and a portfolio that included civic buildings, mixed-use developments, and a community center in Vine City that he had been designing and building pro bono for 2 years because some work is not about the invoice, and he had always understood that. He was known in Atlanta's professional world as someone who was meticulous, visionary, and quietly relentless. The kind of man who arrived at a site at 6 in the morning not to be seen arriving, but because the light at 6 in the morning showed him things about a building that the light at 9 did not. He was also, and this was something he had never fully examined, the kind of man who had learned to be alone with himself in a way that had become its own form of protection. He had a brother, Marcus, who was 3 years younger and lived in Charlotte, and called on birthdays and holidays with the genuine warmth of a sibling who loves you and also does not entirely know you. He had an ex-fiancée named Priscilla, whom he had ended things with 6 months before their wedding for reasons he had explained to no one, and which had left his mother Margaret with a particular quality of unasked question that she had been carrying gracefully and permanently ever since. He had his mother. Margaret Cole was 67 years old and lived in the Cole family estate in Terra Hills, a neighborhood of old Atlanta money that had been deciding for 3 generations what kind of people deserved to be inside it and what kind of people did not. She had been widowed for 9 years. Nathaniel's father, Edward Cole, had died of a heart attack at 61, leaving behind an estate that was managed beautifully and a son who had never fully processed the loss and a daughter who had processed it by becoming more like her mother than she had ever intended to be. Margaret loved Nathaniel with a completeness that was entirely genuine and entirely conditional simultaneously. These two things are not opposites in the way people assume. It is entirely possible to love someone with your whole heart, and to love them in a way that is also about what they represent to you, about the story of your family that you have been building for decades, and into which every person who enters must either fit or be redirected. Margaret had never said this out loud. She had never needed to. The Cole family understood it the way families understand things that are never said but are always present, in the texture of every conversation, in the quality of every welcome, in the specific warmth of a smile that contains within it, for those who know how to read it, a very clear and very firm line. The accident happened at 7:42 in the morning on October the 3rd. Nathaniel was driving south on I-285 toward a client meeting when a distracted driver in a pickup truck ran a red light at the Cascade Road interchange and struck the driver's side of his car at approximately 40 miles an hour. He did not lose consciousness immediately. He remembered the impact, the specific sound of it, which was not the dramatic crash of film and television, but something flatter and more final, a sound that reorganized the world in a single instant. He remembered the airbag. He remembered, with the particular clarity that extreme physical shock sometimes produces, the half-finished architectural drawing on his passenger seat that lifted into the air and then fell back slowly, as if making a decision about where to land. He remembered the sound of someone outside the car saying his name and not understanding how anyone outside the car knew his name. Then he was in an ambulance. Then he was in a hospital. Then there was surgery. And then there was a room with machines that beeped in rhythms he had not learned yet, and a window that showed him a square of Atlanta sky that was the particular pale gray of October mornings in Georgia, and pain that lived in his chest in a way that made every breath a calculation. And then there was Isabella. She introduced herself on his 3rd morning, not with the practiced warmth of performed healthcare, not the bright and efficient cheerfulness that intensive care units sometimes produce in the people who work them as a protective coat against the weight of the work. She introduced herself the way Raymond Cross had taught his daughter to introduce herself to anyone, by looking at the person directly, saying her name clearly, and then asking a question that told them she was actually interested in the answer. She said, "My name is Isabella Cross. I am going to be your primary nurse for the next several days. How did you sleep?" He had looked at her for a moment. He had been asked how he slept by 3 people already that morning, and none of them had waited for the actual answer. He said, "Not well." She had nodded without rushing to fix it. She said, "That is honest. The first few nights are usually the hardest. The body is still in shock and the mind keeps checking on it." She had adjusted his 4-line with the efficient precision of someone who has done the same thing thousands of times and still pays attention. She had said, "Tell me where the pain is worse this morning." And he had told her, And she had listened in the specific way that Isabella Cross listened to everyone. Fully, without the slight distraction of someone composing their response while you were still speaking. And she had noted what he said and adjusted his care accordingly, without making him feel observed or managed. When she left the room 20 minutes later, he lay in the half-light of his hospital room and thought, that is a person who knows how to listen. He did not yet understand what that observation would eventually mean. They talked because he could not sleep, and she moved through the ICU at 2 in the morning with the quiet efficiency of someone completely at home in the dark hours that most of the world ignores. He would hear her footsteps in the corridor before she appeared, a specific rhythm, unhurried, and he began, without quite deciding to find those footsteps reassuring in a way that embarrassed him slightly when he thought about it in the daytime. She would stop at his room during her rounds and check on him, and he would ask questions, not the questions of a man looking for connection, at first, but the questions of a man who is genuinely curious about the person taking care of him in a way that he is not entirely accustomed to being taken care of. He asked about nursing, what drew her to it, what the work asked of her, what it felt like to be the person in the room when someone was at their most frightened and their most honest. She answered directly. She said she had become a nurse because her father had taught her that the most important thing you could do for another person was be present with them in the thing they could not carry alone. That nursing was, at its foundation, exactly that, presence. Real presence, not performed presence. The kind that cost you something and was therefore worth something. He had listened to that and been quiet for a moment and then said, with the particular honesty that hospital rooms sometimes produce in people who would not be that honest elsewhere, I don't think I've ever had anyone just be present with me before. Not the way you mean. She had looked at him. She had said, you should. Everyone should. She had gone back to her rounds. He had watched the door for a long time after she was gone. He was in the hospital for 22 days. By the end of the second week, the nurse's station had a quiet and unofficial understanding that Mr. Cole in room 14 was doing better and that Isabella's 2 in the morning check was lasting considerably longer than 2 in the morning checks typically lasted, and that the quality of quiet in that room had changed from the quiet of a man in pain managing it alone to something that felt more like the quiet of two people who have run out of things to talk about and are not in any hurry about it. No one said anything. In the culture of a hospital, where people are at their most raw and their most real, the nurses who have been doing this work long enough understand the difference between a patient who is developing an attachment and a patient who is being truly seen by someone who is truly seeing him back. Isabella's colleagues understood this distinction. They said nothing to her directly. But on the day Nathaniel Cole was discharged, 3 weeks after his admission, one of the senior nurses walked past Isabella's locker and left a small piece of paper on it that said simply, "Be careful." Isabella had read it. She had put it in her pocket. She had thought about it for a long time. He sent flowers to the nurse's station on the day after his discharge. A large and thoughtful arrangement. Not the generic get-well variety, but something specific, as if he had paid attention to the kind of flowers that existed in the world and chosen accordingly. The card was addressed to the ICU nursing staff, and it said, "Thank you for the care and the patience and the 2 in the morning conversations." And at the bottom, in handwriting that was smaller than the rest, clearly added after the first version of the note was finished, "Isabella, thank you for the chair." She had read that last line 3 times. The chair was a thing she had done without thinking. Pulling it to his bedside on his 5th night, when she found him awake and unable to sleep, and sitting with him for 40 minutes not because she had been asked to and not because it was in her job description, but because it was what she would have wanted if she had been the one lying there in the dark. She had not told anyone about the chair. He had not mentioned it before the note. The fact that he had remembered it, that he had thought about it enough to add a separate line, smaller, clearly an afterthought that was not actually an afterthought, told her something. She folded the card and put it in her locker beside the piece of paper that said "Be careful." She thought about both of them for the rest of the day. He called the hospital 3 days later. He called the main nursing line and asked for Isabella Cross, and the receptionist put the call through, and Isabella answered with the professional warmth she brought to every call, and heard his voice, and felt her own voice do something she chose not to examine immediately. He asked if she would like to have coffee. He said it carefully, the way a man who has been thinking about how to say something for 3 days says it when he has finally decided to say it. And he added that he understood completely if the answer was no, that he knew the professional situation was complicated, that he did not want to put her in a difficult position, and that the coffee was just coffee and she should take as much time as she needed to think about it. She had listened to all of this. She had thought about the chair. She had thought about her father Raymond's voice saying people who are suffering will tell you everything about themselves if you are quiet enough to hear it. She had thought about the 40-minute silence at 2 in the morning and what it had felt like to sit in it with another person without needing to fill it. She said, "I am not your nurse anymore, Mr. Cole." He said, "No, you are not." There was a pause. She said, "I get off at 7 on Thursday." He said, "I will be outside at 7:15. He was outside at 7. She had noticed that and not said anything about it. They had walked to a coffee shop 3 blocks from the hospital and stayed for 2 hours. Neither of them had wanted to leave. Both of them had pretended not to notice this. They had said goodbye at the corner and walked in opposite directions, and Isabella had called Raymond that evening from her car in the parking garage before she could talk herself out of it, and said, "I met someone." Raymond had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about him." She told Raymond about the Vine City Community Center. This was the detail that told Raymond everything he needed to know. Not that Nathaniel Cole was successful or educated or handsome, though Rosa would ask about all of these things in order, but that he was spending 2 years of his professional life building something beautiful for people who could not pay him for it, because he believed it mattered. Raymond had asked a single question: does he know why it matters? And Isabella had thought about the night Nathaniel had told her about the community center, lying in his hospital bed in the ICU with a punctured lung and the quiet focus of a man describing the thing he was most proud of, and she had said, "Yes, he knows exactly why." Raymond had said, "Then pay attention." She had. She was already paying attention. The careful note was still in her locker. She kept paying attention anyway. They built something slowly and with care, the way people build things when they are old enough to understand what hasty construction costs and young enough to still believe the building is worth it. Coffee became walks in Piedmont Park on Sunday mornings, the city quiet around them, the October trees going gold, the conversations moving from the surface of things toward the interior of them with the natural ease of 2 people who have already, in a hospital room at 2 in the morning, said the most honest things about themselves and have therefore passed the stage most relationships spend months attempting to reach. He told her about Priscilla, not in the way of a man confessing a past mistake, but in the way of someone explaining how he had come to understand something important about himself too late to use the understanding at the time. He said he had ended the engagement because he had realized, 6 months before a wedding that his mother had organized with the thoroughness of a military campaign, that he was not marrying Priscilla. He was marrying the idea of himself that his family had decided on when he was 22 years old and had never since revisited. He said this with a clarity that told Isabella it had taken him a long time to find those words, and he had been waiting for the right person to say them to. She had listened without interruption. Then she had said, "Did you ever tell Priscilla that?" He had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "No, I told her I wasn't ready." She had nodded. She had said, "That was not the kindest version of the truth." He had looked at her. He had said, "No, it was not." She had appreciated that he agreed with her without qualifying it. It told her something about who he was. She told him about the 2 years after her mother Rosa's death, the specific texture of that grief, which was different from other kinds of grief in that it arrived not as a single large event, but as an accumulation of small, ordinary moments that Rosa was no longer present in. The first Sunday morning without a phone call. The first Christmas without her mother's tamales on the table. The first time Isabella came home to her apartment after a difficult shift and reached for her phone to call Rosa and remembered, for the 100th time, that there was no call to make. She told him that Raymond had handled his grief by reading, working his way through every book Rosa had ever loved, and leaving small notes in the margins the way Rosa had left small notes in the margins, a conversation across absence. She told him she had handled her grief by being better at her job, that the 2 years after Rosa died were the years she became the nurse people called when the situation was impossible, because she had learned the specific geography of loss and could sit in it with another person without flinching. Nathaniel had listened to all of this. When she finished, he did not say "I am sorry" or "I understand" or any of the phrases that people use when they do not know what to say. He said, "Your mother sounds like she was extraordinary." Isabella had looked at him. She had said, "She was exactly like her tamales." Which sounds strange. But if you ever taste Raymond's version of her recipe, you will understand what I mean. He had laughed, the real laugh, the one she had first heard in the hospital when she said something that caught him off guard. She had decided, quietly, that she was going to keep making him laugh like that for as long as he would let her. He took her to the Vine City Community Center site on a Friday evening in November, 3 weeks after the first coffee. The lot was cleared and the foundation work had begun, and in the fading light of a Georgia November afternoon it was, objectively, a concrete foundation in an empty lot. He stood beside it, and he described what it would become. The main hall with the high ceilings that would let in the afternoon light. The reading room off the east side that he had designed specifically so that the morning sun would come through those windows first. The courtyard in the center that would be the kind of outdoor space that made people want to sit in it rather than pass through it. He described all of this with the focused and lit-up quality of a person talking about the thing they love most, the thing they would do regardless of whether anyone was watching or paying them or telling them it was a good idea. Isabella stood beside him in the November cold and listened to his voice and watched his face and felt something she had been very careful not to name begin to settle into a shape she recognized. She thought about what she had told Raymond. She thought about a man who knew why it mattered. She looked at him describing his building into the empty Georgia evening, and she thought, I am in serious trouble. She did not consider this a problem. He met Raymond in December. This was not a casual meeting. Isabella had not described it that way, and Nathaniel understood immediately that it was not that kind of occasion. Raymond Cross opened the door of the Kirkwood house on a Sunday afternoon in December wearing his best shirt and the expression of a man who has been a sixth-grade English teacher for 31 years and has therefore seen every kind of person walk through a door and knows immediately which kind they are. He shook Nathaniel's hand and held it a moment longer than a standard handshake required, and looked at him the way people look at something they are assessing with full attention. He said, Come in. They sat in the living room where Rose's sewing machine was still visible through the open door of the back room, because Raymond had not moved it and would not move it. Raymond asked Nathaniel about his work, not in the polite way of someone filling conversational space, but in the direct and specific way of a teacher who wants to know what someone actually thinks about what they do. Nathaniel talked about Cole architecture. He talked about the community center. He talked about the specific reason he had taken on the Vine City project, that he had driven through that neighborhood as a young architect and understood that the absence of a certain kind of space was not an accident, that it was a decision made by people with resources who had decided that other people's neighborhoods did not deserve the same quality of attention that their own did, and that he had been bothered by that decision ever since and had decided to do something about it with his own hands and his own time, because waiting for someone else to find it important was the same as deciding it was not. Raymond had listened to all of this without interrupting. When Nathaniel finished, Raymond looked at Isabella and back at Nathaniel and said, I expect you to be worth it. Nathaniel laughed. Then he straightened in his chair and looked Raymond directly in the eyes and said, I intend to be. Raymond had nodded once. He had gone to the kitchen to make coffee. Isabella had looked at Nathaniel, and he had looked at Isabella, and something settled between them that did not need to be named. She had not yet met Margaret. Nathaniel mentioned his mother the way people mention things that are complicated but beloved, with care, with the slight forward lean of someone choosing words that are accurate without being complete. He told Isabella that his mother was strong. He told her that she loved him in a way that was total and also all-consuming, and that the two things had always existed together in a combination he had spent his adult life learning to navigate. He told her that his mother had opinions about everything and the particular confidence of someone who has never been required by life's circumstances to consider that her opinions might be wrong. He said all of this with the warm weariness of a son who loves his mother and also understands her completely. Isabella listened to all of it. She noted what was said. She also noted what was not said, the pauses, the careful word choices, the way he looked at a point slightly above her head when he talked about his mother, as if he was tracking something in the middle distance. She filed it carefully in the part of her that paid attention to the things people did not say and understood them as the more important part of the conversation. She did not push for more. She simply waited. She was good at waiting. It was, in many ways, the most important skill she had. The first time Margaret Cole heard Isabella Cross's name was on a Sunday evening phone call in mid-December. Nathaniel had been calling his mother every Sunday since he was 24 years old. It was a habit born of his father's sudden death and the specific guilt of a son who had not called the week before and has been calling every week since to make sure the gap never happens again. He told Margaret about Isabella carefully. He gave her the facts in the order that he had decided was the right order. That Isabella was a nurse, that she had been his primary nurse during his hospital stay, that they had begun seeing each other after his discharge, that she was extraordinary, and he wanted his mother to know about her. Margaret had listened. She had asked 3 questions. Where was she from? What was her family? And had Nathaniel thought carefully about the optics of the situation? The word optics had landed in the conversation like a stone into still water. Nathaniel had said, I have thought about whether I am happy and whether she is the reason. Margaret had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said that she looked forward to meeting Isabella and that she hoped Nathaniel was taking care of himself after the accident and that she loved him. She had not said anything else. But the word optics stayed in the conversation for a long time after she hung up, the way certain words stay even after the conversation is over, carrying the full weight of what they were sent to do. The 40-second phone call came on a Tuesday morning in January. Isabella was at home, on her day off, still in her kitchen clothes with her second cup of coffee, reading the kind of book that Raymond gave her every Christmas, something she would not have chosen for herself that turned out to be exactly what she needed. Her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. She answered. The voice on the other end was warm, cultivated, Southern in the specific way of old Atlanta, a warmth that had been polished for so long it had taken on the quality of something structural rather than emotional. The voice said, Isabella, this is Margaret Cole, Nathaniel's mother. I hope I am not catching you at a bad time. Isabella had set her book down. She had said, not at all. Margaret had said she would so love to have Isabella for dinner sometime soon, that she felt they ought to know each other, that family was everything to her, and that Nathaniel was everything to her, and that she simply wanted to understand the people in his life. All of this was said in the warm and absolute tone of someone who has already decided every outcome of every conversation before the conversation begins. And then there was a pause. And into that pause Margaret said, gently, warmly, as if she were saying something that Isabella had clearly already arrived at herself and simply needed to hear confirmed. I think we both know, dear, that you are not what our family needs. And the call ended. 40 seconds. Isabella had sat at her kitchen table for a long time with the phone face down on the wood. The morning light was coming through the east window the way it always came. She thought about her mother Rosa saying a house that knows which direction it is going catches the morning light first. She thought about the piece of paper in her locker that said be careful. She thought about Raymond's voice saying people who are suffering will tell you everything about themselves. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. She was a woman who thought. She thought for 3 days. On the 3rd day, she told Nathaniel. She told him the way she told everything that mattered, directly, without softening the information in a way that would make it easier to receive, but less accurate. She told him what his mother had said, and she told him the tone in which it had been said, and she told him that the tone mattered as much as the words. Nathaniel had gone very still in the way she had learned to recognize. The stillness he kept for things that required him to manage his response before producing it, which was different from the stillness he kept for contentment and different again from the stillness he kept for pain. He said, when did she call you? She told him. He said, she didn't tell me. Isabella had said, no, I didn't think she had. He had stood up from the table where they were sitting in her apartment, and he had walked to the window and looked at the street below for a minute. Then he had picked up his phone and called his mother. Isabella heard none of that conversation. She stayed at the kitchen table and read 4 pages of her book without retaining a single sentence, and then put it down and looked at the wall and thought about the specific weight of the thing she was inside. When Nathaniel came back from the other room, his face had the particular quality of someone who has just been reminded of something they had managed, for a few good months, to forget. He said, I am sorry. She said, what did she say? He said, that she was being honest with me in a way she felt she couldn't be with you present. That she has concerns. Isabella had nodded slowly. She had said, I know. He had looked at her. She said, Nathaniel, I know. She was not asking him to fix it. She was telling him she understood exactly what they were inside, and she needed him to understand it too. Victoria Cole arrived 2 weeks later. She drove up from Savannah for a weekend that Margaret had described as a family check-in and which was, in the way of Cole family events, precisely as described, and also something else entirely. Victoria was 38 years old and bore the particular refinement of a woman who had been raised to understand that intelligence and appearance are tools, and that the most effective use of both is to let other people underestimate you while you assess them completely. She had worked for 10 years as a corporate attorney in Savannah and had the kind of mind that could hold a conversation at the surface while running a completely separate analysis underneath it. She found Isabella at Nathaniel's apartment on Saturday afternoon, not by accident, because Victoria Cole did very little by accident, and she was warm in the way of the Cole family warmth. Genuine at the surface, assessing underneath, structured to tell you that you are welcome while simultaneously measuring you for the space you might occupy and whether it is a space the family has designated for you. She told Isabella she was lovely. She meant part of it. She told Nathaniel later, in the kitchen while Isabella was in the other room, that she had concerns about the long-term practical fit of this relationship and that she simply wanted him to be thoughtful. She used the word practical 4 times. She never said what she meant by it. She did not need to. The campaign that followed was quiet in the way that well-executed campaigns always are. It did not arrive with confrontation or obvious hostility, both of which would have been easier to address and both of which the Cole women were too sophisticated to produce. What it arrived with was patience, a particular quality of patience that is only available to people who believe, with complete and unexamined confidence, that they will ultimately prevail because they always have. Margaret began calling Nathaniel more frequently. The calls were warm and loving. They were always warm and loving, but they multiplied and they lengthened, and they began to arrive at times that had previously been times Nathaniel spent with Isabella, and the cumulative effect of this was a series of small rearrangements in Nathaniel's availability that were individually explainable and collectively telling. Isabella noticed. She was the kind of person who noticed things without needing to be told to notice them. She mentioned it to Raymond one Sunday from her usual park bench. It was February now and cold, but she still went outside for the calls because the open air still felt more honest than her apartment. And Raymond had listened and then been quiet for a moment and then said, "What does Nathaniel say about it?" She had said, "He says it's just his mother being his mother." Raymond had been quiet again. He said, "Is he right?" She had thought about it honestly. She had said, "Partly. He's right that it's always been this way. He's not examining whether it has to stay this way." Raymond had said, "That is the question, then." She had sat on the bench in the February cold and looked at the Atlanta skyline and thought about what it meant to love someone and know, with complete clarity, the exact shape of the difficulty ahead. The dinner at Tara Hills happened in March. Nathaniel had told Isabella about it a week in advance. Carefully, in the way he was careful when he was managing information he was not sure how to present. He told her it was a family dinner, something his mother organized periodically, and that it would be an opportunity for Isabella and Margaret to spend time together properly for the first time since the phone call. Isabella had agreed to go. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for difficult things, by being entirely herself, because she had learned long ago that performing a version of yourself for people who have decided not to accept you is an exhausting and ultimately pointless exercise. She had dressed with the specific care of a woman who understands the difference between dressing to impress and dressing to be unassailable. She had worn her mother Rose's gold earrings. She had arrived at the Tara Hills estate with Nathaniel at 6 in the evening and stood in the entrance hall of a house that said everything about itself in a single glance. Old money, old rules, an interior that had been curated over decades to communicate exactly who lived there and exactly what was expected of anyone who entered. Margaret had embraced her at the door with the warmth of someone who has decided to be warm and intends to remain so regardless of the content of the evening. She had called Isabella dear twice in the first 3 minutes. Each use of the word was warm. Each use of the word was also a decision. The dinner lasted 2 hours. It was perfectly civil. Margaret asked Isabella about her work, about her family, about her education and her background, in the tone of someone conducting an assessment while performing a social call. Isabella answered directly and completely and without apology. She told Margaret about Raymond and Rosa. She told her about nursing school and Piedmont and the 10 years of her career. She told her about Kirkwood and the brick house and the east-facing porch. She told all of it without embellishment and without diminishment because she had nothing to be ashamed of and she was not going to behave as if she did. Margaret had listened with the warm and polished attention she brought to everything. At the end of the evening, she had embraced Isabella again at the door and told her it had been a pleasure. Isabella had thanked her. She had sat in Nathaniel's car on the drive back to the city and looked at the dark Georgia highway unrolling ahead of them and thought, "That was the most expensive dinner I have ever been to, and I did not touch the food." Nathaniel had asked her how she thought it went. She had looked at him. She had said, "Your mother is very good at what she does." He had been quiet. He had said, "I know." She had said, "Do you?" He had not answered immediately. The silence in the car had lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. Isabella had looked at the highway. She had thought about Raymond's voice. She had thought about the note in her locker. She had thought about the chair. She had decided, quietly, to keep her eyes open. The months that followed were not a decline. They were something more complicated than a decline and therefore harder to name. They were the months in which Nathaniel Cole was being slowly and expertly reminded of who he was supposed to be by people who loved him completely and understood him only partially and were not interested in examining the difference. Margaret's calls continued to multiply. Victoria visited twice more, once in April and once in May, and each visit produced the same structure. Warmth at the surface, a conversation with Nathaniel in a room Isabella was not in, and a quality in Nathaniel's demeanor afterward that Isabella recognized as the particular mood of a man who has been reminded of obligations he had not been thinking about. She did not confront him about the visits. She asked about them. He told her they were nothing to worry about. She noted that nothing to worry about was not the same as nothing. She kept paying attention. The campaign was patient, and it was consistent, and it was built on the understanding, which was correct, that Nathaniel Cole was a man who had been navigating his family's definition of who he should be for so long that he no longer always noticed when he was being navigated. He was not a weak man. He was a man with a mother he loved and a history of managing her love by accommodating it. And those two things had become so intertwined over 41 years that separating them required a kind of deliberate attention he had not yet decided to give. Isabella had a conversation with her colleague Denise in April. Denise, who had left the Be Careful note, and who had known Isabella for 8 years, and who had the kind of friendship that is built on seeing each other clearly rather than comfortably. They were in the break room at Piedmont after a long shift, and Denise had asked how things were going, and Isabella had told her the truth, which she did not always do, and which told Denise that things were at a stage that required truth rather than management. She told Denise about Margaret and Victoria and the dinner at Tara Hills, and the multiplying phone calls and the quality in Nathaniel's face after his family's visits. Denise had listened carefully. Then she said, "What does he do?" Not what does he say? What does he do? Isabella had thought about this. She had said, "He shows up. He is consistent. He is kind, and he is present, and when I am with him I believe him." Denise had said, "But?" Isabella had said, "But I can see the shape of the thing they are building, and I am not sure he can see it yet." Denise had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "What happens if he never sees it?" Isabella had looked at her coffee. She had said, "Then I will have to decide whether to keep pointing at it." Denise had said, "And what do you think the answer to that is?" Isabella had said nothing for a long moment. Then she had said, "I think the answer is that I know exactly what I am worth. I have always known that. The question is whether he is going to figure it out before or after I have to remind him." Denise had nodded. She had said, "Good." Isabella had said, "It does not feel particularly good right now." Denise had said, "I know. It doesn't yet. Keep going." She had. The Vine City Community Center was making visible progress by May. The walls were up and the roof was being set, and Nathaniel had taken Isabella there on a Saturday morning in the warm Georgia spring, and she had stood in the unfinished main hall and looked up through the open roof at the blue sky above and felt the specific quality of a space that was going to matter to the people who would eventually live inside it. He had described it to her months ago as a foundation in an empty lot. Now it was walls and light, and the beginning of a shape that she could recognize as the thing he had described. She had looked at it for a long time. Then she had looked at him. She had said, "It is everything you said it would be." He had looked at her the way he looked at her when he was storing something. Adding it to the private archive he kept of the moments that mattered. He said, "I needed someone to see it with." She had understood what he meant. She had thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. She had thought about what it meant to be the person someone needed to see something with. She had thought about whether being needed was the same as being chosen. She had decided they were not the same thing. She had decided that what she needed was both. The photograph arrived on a Saturday morning in June under the door of Isabella's apartment in Inman Park. She found it on her way to make coffee. A plain white envelope on the floor just inside the door, no return address, no note. Inside was a single printed photograph. It showed a formal party setting, flowers arranged on tables, champagne glasses in people's hands, the particular quality of a Tara Hills gathering that Isabella had attended once and would therefore recognize immediately. Nathaniel was in the center of the photograph, standing beside a woman Isabella had never seen. The woman was in a red dress, elegant, composed, bearing the specific ease of someone who is entirely at home in this setting because she has been at home in it for years. Margaret was visible in the background with the open and genuine smile she wore when the world was going the way she had decided it should go. Victoria was laughing at something off camera. Everyone in the photograph was at home in it. Everyone in the photograph belonged, in the specific and unspoken language of Tara Hills, to the world it represented. The photograph had no note. It did not need one. Isabella held it for a moment. She turned it over. Nothing on the back. She set it on her kitchen table beside her coffee, and she looked at it for a long time. She called Nathaniel. He did not answer. She called again 5 minutes later. He did not answer. She called a third time. Nothing. She put the phone down on the table beside the photograph. The morning light was coming through her east window. She thought about her mother. She picked up the phone and called Raymond. He answered on the first ring the way he always answered when she called on a day that was not Sunday. She said, "Can I come home?" He said, "I will put the coffee on." She drove to Kirkwood. She sat on the porch with her father and the Atlanta morning around them, and she showed him the photograph, and she did not have to explain it, because Raymond Cross had been reading people clearly for 68 years, and a photograph is not a complicated document when you understand what it is saying. Nathaniel called back that evening. He called 4 times in the space of an hour, which was itself information. When she answered, he sounded like a man who had been rehearsing what to say and had not yet found the version that was adequate. He said, "The gathering was bigger than I expected." She waited. He said, "My mother invited some people." She waited. He said, "There is something I need to explain." She said, "Who is the woman in the red dress?" There was silence on his end of the line. 7 seconds. 7 seconds is a very long time when you are sitting in your father's house in East Atlanta holding your mother's earrings in your hand and waiting for the man you love to tell you the truth. He said, "Her name is Camille Hartwell. She is someone my mother has known for years." Isabella said nothing. He said, "I want you to understand that I did not know what the gathering was. I thought it was a family dinner." Isabella said, "But you went." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you didn't call me before you went." He said, "I should have called." She said, "Yes, you should have." There was another silence. Isabella looked at her father on the other side of the porch. Raymond was looking at the street. He had the expression he wore when he was letting someone figure out something they already knew. Isabella looked at the photograph on the table between them. She looked at the woman in the red dress. She looked at Margaret's genuine and open smile in the background. She thought about the 40-second phone call. She thought about the word optics. She thought about every conversation she had had with Nathaniel about his mother in which she had heard the pauses more clearly than the words and had said nothing because she had believed in the man sitting across from her and had believed, with the specific and costly optimism of someone who loves someone they know is capable of more, that he was going to be the version of himself she could already see. She met Camille Hartwell without intending to. This happened on a Sunday afternoon in July when Isabella was leaving the Piedmont Park Farmers Market with 2 bags of produce and her earphones in and turned a corner onto the path by the lake and walked directly into the social orbit of a group of women that included Margaret Cole, Victoria Cole, and a woman in a white linen dress whose face she recognized from the photograph immediately. Isabella stopped. Margaret saw her at the same moment, and the 2 women looked at each other across the 10 feet of Atlanta's summer afternoon that separated them. Margaret recovered first, because Margaret always recovered first. She smiled. She said, "Isabella, what a coincidence." She said it in the warm and practiced tone that Isabella had come to understand as Margaret's most carefully deployed register. Warmth so thorough it contained no seam, no gap through which anything could enter or exit. She introduced the women in her group with the smooth efficiency of someone conducting a presentation they have given before. She introduced Camille Hartwell last, with the specific warmth she reserved for people she was choosing to elevate within a social context. She said, "And this is Camille, a dear family friend." Camille extended her hand with the ease of a woman who has been shaking hands at Tara Hill's events since she was 16 years old. She said, "Isabella, I've heard so much about you." The way she said it was neither hostile nor warm. It was the way you say something when you have been told about a person by someone who has a particular position on that person, and you are choosing to relay the tone without the content. Isabella shook her hand. She looked at Camille directly, and clearly the way Raymond had taught her to look at people she needed to understand. She said, "It was lovely to meet you." She said goodbye to Margaret and Victoria. She walked back to her car. She sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes. She was not upset. She was something colder and more focused than upset. She was understanding something she had been refusing to understand completely for 8 months. She drove to Raymond's house. She did not call ahead. Raymond opened the door before she knocked because he had seen her car from the window. They sat at the kitchen table with the good coffee, the kind Rosa had ordered from a place in New Orleans that Raymond still ordered from 9 years after her death, because some habits are the same as keeping a person. Isabella told her father everything. Not the summary version and not the version shaped for someone else's comfort. The full version, in the order it had happened, from the 40-second phone call in January through the dinner at Tara Hill's, and the multiplying phone calls and Victoria's visits, and the photograph under the door, and the 7 seconds of silence on the phone, and the encounter in the park that afternoon. Raymond listened to all of it the way he listened to everything. Completely, without interrupting, without the slight distraction of someone composing their response while you were still speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee. He said, "What are you going to do?" She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Yes, you do." She had looked at him. He had looked back at her with the direct and complete attention of a man who has spent 68 years being honest with the people he loves. He said, "Isabella, you know." She had looked at the table. She had looked at Rosa's sewing machine still visible through the open door of the back room. She had thought about a woman who had worked in quiet and understood that the work you did when no one was watching was the most important work of all. She had thought about the seams left unfinished that show themselves eventually. She had thought about a man in a hospital room at 2 in the morning saying, "I don't think I've ever had anyone just be present with me before." She had thought about what it cost her to be that person and what it cost him to require it. She had said, "I know." She did know. She had known for some time. Knowing and being ready are different things. She was becoming ready. She ended it on a Sunday evening in July, from her own apartment, on her own terms. She had thought about how to do this for a week, and she had decided that the only way to do something like this with integrity was to do it clearly and without the kind of anger that would make it about the anger rather than about the truth. Nathaniel had come to her apartment that evening. She had asked him to come, which he had done immediately, which told her everything about the man he was and also about the gap between who he was and how he had been behaving. And she had made tea because making tea was something to do with your hands when you are about to say something irreversible. She had sat across from him at the kitchen table where the photograph had been 2 weeks earlier, and she had looked at him directly, and she had said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." He had said, "Okay." She had said, "I held your hand through the worst night of your life. I learned the sound of your breathing. I sat with you at 2 in the morning because you needed someone to just be there, and I was that person because you deserved it. I have spent 8 months being the person who sees you most clearly and believes in you most completely. I have watched your family tell you in 100 different ways that I am not enough for the life they have built for you, and I have watched you manage that rather than address it, and I have stayed because I believed you were going to choose. I still believe that about you, but I am not willing to wait for you to choose while your family makes the choice for you. I deserve someone who tells the people they love that I am not negotiable. You have not done that. And until you do, there is nothing here for me to stay for." She said all of this in the voice she used when she was telling a patient the truth they needed to hear. Warm, direct, without cruelty, and without softening. When she finished, she did not fill the silence. She let it be there. He sat across from her table with the expression of a man who has just heard someone describe him accurately and completely, and cannot dispute a single word of it. He said, "Isabella." She said, "I know." She said it gently. She said, "I know who you are. That is why this is hard. Please go." He did not move for a long moment. Then he stood up. He looked at her for a long time. He said, I am going to fix this. She said, I hope you do. But that is not the same as asking you to come back. He nodded once. He left. She sat at her kitchen table in the July evening and listened to the silence of her apartment. Then she called Raymond. He answered on the first ring. She said, I am okay. He said, I know you are. I have always known you were. She went back to work the following Monday with the particular focused energy of a woman who has done something difficult and necessary and is now channeling the energy of that difficulty into the place where she has always been most herself. Her colleagues noticed something different about her and could not fully name it. A quality in her bearing, a directness that had always been there, but had taken on a new completeness. Denise noticed and said nothing and brought her a coffee without being asked. Isabella worked her shift with full attention. She cared for her patients with the same complete presence she had always brought to the work. She did not think about Nathaniel. She thought about her patients. She thought about Raymond. She thought about Rose's sewing machine and the seams that show themselves eventually and the work you do when no one is watching. She went home to her apartment in Inman Park and she sat on her small porch in the July evening and she looked at the Atlanta sky and she let herself feel exactly what she felt. The grief of it, the rightness of it, the particular loneliness of a woman who has made the correct decision and has not yet arrived at the part where the correct decision feels like anything other than loss. She called Raymond that evening. She told him she had gone back to work. He said, good. She said, it was good. He said, it always is. She said, Raymond. He said, yes. She said, thank you for teaching me what I am worth. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, your mother taught you that. I just made sure you remembered it. Nathaniel Cole did not move forward with Camille Hartwell. This is not something that happened quickly or cleanly. Nothing in the Cole family happened quickly or cleanly when it came to decisions that had been decided by Margaret years before they were announced. But within 2 weeks of the Sunday evening in Isabella's apartment, it had become clear to everyone who paid attention to Nathaniel Cole that something had changed in him in a way that was not temporary and was not manageable. He refused the next 2 social events at Tara Hills that his mother had organized. He did not answer Victoria's calls for 4 days. He went to the Vine City Community Center on a Saturday morning and stood in the main hall for 2 hours by himself looking at the light coming through the high windows he had designed for that specific quality of afternoon illumination, and he thought about a woman standing in an unfinished building saying it is everything you said it would be. He thought about what it had felt like to have someone see the thing he was most proud of and understand it completely without needing it explained. He thought about 40 minutes at 2 in the morning. He thought about a woman who had sat with him in his pain without trying to fix it and had thereby fixed it more thoroughly than anything else could have. He thought about the 7 seconds. He thought about those 7 seconds for a long time. They were the 7 seconds in which he had been silent when he should have spoken, and he understood now that those 7 seconds were the most expensive 7 seconds of his life. He went to Tara Hills in August. He called ahead, and he drove out on a Tuesday afternoon, not a family gathering day, not a social occasion, an ordinary Tuesday. And he sat down at the kitchen table in the house where he had grown up, and he told his mother the truth. He told her all of it. He told her about the 40-second phone call that he had learned about 8 months ago and had not addressed because he had been managing rather than confronting. He told her about the photograph and where he believed it had come from. He told her about Camille Hartwell and what he understood to be his mother's intention there. He told her that he had lost someone who was extraordinary because he had been too accommodating of a version of himself that he had outgrown at 35 and had been too habituated to notice. He said all of this without raising his voice and without cruelty. He was his mother's son, and he had her composure, if not always her strategy, but with a directness and a completeness that Margaret Cole had not heard from her son in 41 years of conversations. She listened. She was quiet in the way she was quiet when something had entered her understanding that she could not immediately redirect. Then she said, I have always wanted what is best for you. He said, I know. He said, but what you want for me and what is best for me are not the same thing, and they have not been for a long time, and I have been too accommodating of the gap between them. Margaret said nothing. He said, Isabella Cross is the most extraordinary person I have ever known. I lost her because I was too slow to say that clearly enough, and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure I say it. He stood up from the table. He said, I love you, Mama. I am coming back when this is resolved. He drove back to Atlanta. He called Victoria from the car. He told her the same things. Victoria was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I hear you." It was not an apology. It was the beginning of one. He stood outside Piedmont Atlanta Hospital on a Tuesday morning in September at 7:45 in the morning, exactly 11 months after his accident had brought him there the first time. He had not called ahead. He walked to the nurse's station on the ICU floor, and he asked for Isabella Cross, and the nurse at the desk looked at him with the evaluating gaze of a woman who has heard about this situation from colleagues and has formed a view on it. She said, "She's with a patient." He said, "I'll wait." He sat in the waiting area with the particular quality of stillness he kept for things that required him to be honest with himself without management. He waited for 2 hours. He thought about all of it. He thought about the chair. He thought about, "I don't think I've ever had anyone just be present with me before." He thought about, "Everyone should." He thought about 7 seconds and what they cost. He thought about a woman telling him clearly that she knew who he was, and that was why it was hard. He waited. And then Isabella Cross came around the corner at the end of the corridor and saw him and stopped walking. She was in her scrubs and her hair was pulled back, and she had the expression she wore after a long shift. The focused, slightly internal look of someone whose full attention has been given completely to another person for 8 hours and is now returning to themselves. She saw him and stopped. He stood up. He said nothing yet. He simply stood. She looked at him from the end of the corridor for a long moment. The nurse's station was between them. He could see 2 nurses pretending not to watch. She walked toward him. She stopped a few feet away. He said, "I owe you a chair." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "You have 10 minutes. He had said, "Thank you." She had taken him to the family consultation room at the end of the corridor, a small room with 2 chairs and a box of tissues on the table, and the particular quality of quiet that rooms used for difficult conversations develop over time. She had sat down. He had sat across from her, and he had said everything he had spent 2 months finding the words for. He told her that he had gone to Tara Hills and told his mother the truth in its entirety. He told her what he had said, and he told her what Margaret had said, and he told her that the conversation had not ended in resolution, but had ended in honesty, and that honesty was, for the Cole family, a more significant departure than resolution. He told her about the phone call to Victoria. He told her that he had not moved forward with Camille Hartwell and had no intention of doing so, and had told his mother this directly. He told her that he had spent the months since July at the Vine City Community Center working on the building with a focus that was not entirely about the building. That he had gone there because it was the place where he most clearly remembered who he was when he was with her, and he had needed to be in that place while he figured out what to do next. He told her that he had thought about the chair every single day since July. He told her that he had been wrong, not about wanting her, but about how slowly he had moved to say so, about how many accommodations he had made toward a version of his life that no longer fit him, while she waited for him to notice the fit had changed. He said all of this without asking her for anything. He was not making a request. He was telling her the truth. Isabella had listened to all of it. She had been quiet for a long moment. She had said, "Did you mean it when you said you were going to spend the rest of your life making sure you say it clearly?" He had said, "Yes." She had said, "That is a long time." He had said, "I know." She had said, "Why?" He had understood what she was asking. He said, "Because you are the person who taught me that being present with someone is the most important thing you can give them. Because you were completely present with me when I had nothing to offer you except my pain and my confusion and my family's complications. Because I have spent 41 years learning how to build things, and you are the first thing I have wanted to build that I did not have a blueprint for, and that terrified me, and I handled the terror badly." He had stopped. She had looked at him. He said, "And because I have never been able to make myself be somewhere you are not since the day I left this hospital." She was quiet for a long moment. The box of tissues between them was untouched. She said, "You had 10 minutes, and you took considerably longer." He said, "I know." She said, "I noticed." There was a pause. He said, "What does that mean?" She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "It means you may call me." She stood up. She said, "I have to go back to work." She was at the door. She turned. She said, "Nathaniel." He looked at her. She said, "You better not waste it." She went back to her shift. He sat in the consultation room for a moment. Then he stood up. He walked out through the hospital lobby. He walked to his car. He sat in it, and he thought about what she had said and what it meant. He called Raymond. Raymond answered on the second ring. Nathaniel said, "Mr. Cross." Raymond said, "I have been expecting your call." How is my daughter? Nathaniel said, she told me not to waste it. Raymond said, she learned that from her mother. Don't waste it. They rebuilt slowly and with more care than the first time, which had itself been careful, which meant that this second beginning was the most deliberate thing either of them had done. They went back to the beginning of the things that had mattered, the Sunday morning walks, the coffee, the late evenings that stretched because neither of them was in a hurry for them to end. But it was different now in the way that everything is different after you have been to the edge of a thing and come back. The conversations had a different quality, more honest, less managed, the kind of honest that is only available to people who have already said the most difficult things to each other and survived the saying. He told her everything he had said to his mother. She told him everything she had thought in the months they were apart. These were not easy conversations. They were the kind of conversations that require you to look at yourself clearly and then let the other person look at you clearly and to trust that what they see will not make them leave. They had both earned that trust. They were not careless with it. Victoria Cole called Isabella on a Thursday morning in November. Isabella saw the name on her screen and answered with the particular composed readiness of a woman who has been through enough of this family's conversations to know that they are never simply what they appear to be on the surface. Victoria said, I am going to say something directly, and I need you to hear it directly. Isabella said, that is the only way I would want it. Victoria had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, I was wrong about you. I want you to know that I understand that. I made assessments of you that were based on what I needed to believe in order to protect a version of my family that I had decided was correct. I was wrong. You are not what I said you were, and you are not what I implied, and Nathaniel is better with you than he has ever been, and I was too invested in the story I had already written to see that until it was almost too late. Isabella had listened to all of this. She had said, thank you for saying it directly. Victoria had said, you are welcome. There had been a pause. Victoria said, I hope you know that I intend to be better. Isabella had said, I do know that. I have always been good at knowing what people are capable of. Victoria had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said something that Isabella would tell Raymond about that Sunday, and that Raymond would think about for a long time afterward. Victoria had said, my mother is going to take longer. I want you to know I understand that about her, and that I will not let it go unchallenged the way I did before. Isabella had said, I know. Victoria said, how do you know? Isabella said, because you just said it directly. And I believe you. There had been a pause. Victoria said, I think I understand now why my brother waited in a hospital corridor for 2 hours. Isabella said, he waited longer than 2 hours. Victoria said, of course he did. Of course he did. Nathaniel proposed to Isabella on a Saturday morning in December at the Vine City Community Center. The building was finished by then. The high ceilings, the reading room with the morning light, the courtyard in the center that made people want to sit in it rather than pass through it. He had taken her there in the early morning before anyone else arrived, and they had stood in the main hall together in the winter light, and he had shown her everything he had described to her on a cold November evening more than a year ago, when it had been a foundation in an empty lot. She had walked through each room slowly. She had looked up at the high ceilings and the way the winter light moved through them. She had stood in the reading room and felt the specific quality of a space that had been built by someone who understood what he was building it for. He had said, I need to ask you something. She had turned around. He was holding a ring that had belonged to Rosa Cross, that Raymond had given him 2 weeks earlier, along with the words she learned that from her mother, and a look that told Nathaniel everything he needed to know about the kind of man Raymond considered him to be and the kind of man he was being trusted to become. He said, Isabella, I built this place because I believe that some spaces matter more than their invoice. That some things are worth 2 years of your best effort with no guarantee of return because the value is in the building of them and the people who will eventually live inside them. I have been slow in some things that mattered. I have been careless in some ways that cost us both. But I have never been unclear about this. About you. Will you let me build something with you? Something that has very good light. She had looked at him for a long moment. She had looked at the ring. She had thought about Rosa. She had thought about Raymond on the porch. She had thought about the chair. She had thought about the building around them, the high ceilings and the morning light and the courtyard where people would sit rather than pass through, and the reading room where some child in Vine City would one day sit with a book that their public library did not have and find in it something true at the right moment and carry it ever since. She said yes. Raymond cried when Nathaniel called him from the community center parking lot. He did not try to hide it. He said, "Her mother would have loved you." Nathaniel said, "I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure I deserve that." Raymond had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "You already do, son." It was the first time he had used that word. It was the only time that mattered. The engagement was announced in December, and it moved through Atlanta's social networks with the particular speed that announcements move when they involve someone whose family has been deciding things in this city for 3 generations. It reached Margaret Cole on a Tuesday morning through Nathaniel himself, who called her before she could hear it from anyone else, which she recognized as a kindness. Margaret had been quiet for a long time when he told her. Then she had said, "Are you happy?" He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Is she the reason?" He had said, "Yes." There had been a long silence. Margaret said, "Then I will learn to be happy about it." It was not a warm acceptance. It was a real one. Nathaniel had understood the difference and had decided that real was enough to start with. He had told Isabella what his mother had said. Isabella had looked at him for a moment. She had said, "That is the most honest thing your mother has ever said to me." He had said, "I know." She had said, "I can work with honest." He had said, "I thought you might." The wedding was held on a Saturday in April at the Vine City Community Center. This had been Isabella's idea, and Nathaniel had agreed immediately, in the way he agreed to things that were exactly right before he had finished thinking about them. The building had been open for 3 months by then, and the community it had been built for had already begun the process of making it their own. After-school programs, a reading circle for seniors, a Saturday morning class for children who wanted to learn to draw buildings. On the morning of the wedding, the main hall was filled with flowers that Rose's old seamstress friends had arranged over 3 days, and with people who represented the full geography of Isabella and Nathaniel's lives together. Raymond walked Isabella down the aisle in his best suit, and Rose's earrings were in Isabella's ears, and when Raymond gave her hand to Nathaniel, he leaned in and said, quietly enough that only the two of them heard, "You were worth it. I always told you that you were worth it." Isabella had squeezed his hand. She had looked at Nathaniel. The high windows above them were doing exactly what Nathaniel had designed them to do, letting in the April morning light in a way that made everyone in the room feel, without knowing exactly why, that they were somewhere that had been made for them. Margaret Cole sat in the front row in her best dress with the posture of a woman who has decided something and intends to honor the decision. Victoria sat beside her, and when the ceremony began, Victoria had reached over and taken her mother's hand and held it, and Margaret had let her. It was not nothing. For the Cole family it was, in fact, considerable. The dedication plaque inside the main entrance of the Vine City Community Center reads as follows: "Built for the Vine City community with gratitude, intention, and the belief that every person deserves a space that makes them feel held. Cole Architecture, Atlanta, Georgia." And beneath the project information, in smaller letters that Nathaniel had added to the design, without telling anyone until the day the plaque was installed, and which Isabella had read for the first time standing in the doorway of the building where they had been married 3 months earlier. "For Isabella, who taught me that the most important thing you can build is the space where someone feels completely held." Isabella had read it 3 times. She had stood in the doorway of the community center in the July afternoon, and she had felt the Atlanta heat and the particular quality of a Georgia summer that sits in the body like something alive, and she had thought about a hospital room at 2 in the morning and a chair pulled to a bedside, and a man saying, "I don't think I've ever had anyone just be present with me before." She had thought about 40 seconds on a phone in January, and the word "dear" and the warmth that contained within it a very clear and very firm line. She had thought about Raymond teaching her what she was worth, and Rosa sewing in the back room, with the focused quiet of someone who understood that the work you do when no one is watching is the most important work of all. She had thought about all of it. She had stood in the doorway of a building that had been built because someone believed some things were worth 2 years of your best effort with no guarantee of return. She had thought that this was what love was, finally, not the thing that arrives without effort, but the thing you build over and over again, because the building is the point and the space you make for another person is the most honest declaration of what you believe they deserve. This is what it costs to love someone whose family has decided in advance who is and is not worthy of their name. It costs patience and clarity and the specific courage of a woman who knows her own worth so completely that she does not require anyone else's confirmation of it, but also does not accept its denial. It costs the willingness to walk away from something real because you have decided that real is not enough without being chosen, that being needed and being chosen are not the same thing, and that you deserve both. It costs the kind of honesty that only comes from sitting with someone at 2 in the morning in the worst part of what they are going through and understanding that presence, real presence, not performed presence, is the most valuable thing you can give another person and the thing most people never give completely. Isabella Cross gave that to a man in a hospital room in Atlanta, and it cost her 18 months of navigating a family that had decided who she was before they knew her and a relationship that required her to keep saying clearly what she was worth until the person she loved was ready to say it back. She did not become smaller in those 18 months. She became more completely herself. She went back to her patients and her father and the east-facing porch and the good coffee from New Orleans and the specific quality of a life that belongs entirely to a person who knows what it is worth and has stopped waiting for permission to live it fully. And then she was found by someone who had finally, at the cost of 7 seconds of silence and 2 hours in a hospital corridor and a conversation at a kitchen table in Terra Hills, that was the most honest thing the Cole family had said to each other in 30 years, figured out that being the person who shows up is not the same as being the person who chooses. And he chose. There is a woman in Atlanta who goes to the Vine City Community Center every Saturday morning and sits in the reading room where the morning light comes through the east-facing windows and reads with the same focused quiet as a woman who understood that the work you do when no one is watching is the most important work of all. She takes her coffee from the same New Orleans supplier her father-in-law still uses 9 years after Rose's death. She wears small gold earrings that belonged to her mother. She is a nurse by profession and a builder by temperament, and she understands, more clearly than most people will in their entire lives, what it means to make a space where someone feels completely held. If you are watching this tonight and you recognize something in Isabella's story, if you have ever been told by someone's silence or someone's family or someone's 40-second phone call that you are not what they need, then you already know what Isabella knew. You know what you are worth. You do not need anyone's confirmation. What you may need, and what this story is for, is the reminder that walking away from something that does not choose you is not giving up. It is making the space for something that will. If this story found you tonight, tell us. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what you are thinking. Tell us if you have ever had to walk away from something real in order to make room for something truer. Because those stories matter. Every single one of them matters. And if this channel has given you something tonight, a story that stayed with you, a sentence that found you at the right moment, the particular comfort of knowing that someone else's experience maps onto something you have felt but never heard described, then subscribe to Letters Never Sent. Because we have more stories coming. Stories about people who knew their own worth and waited for the world to catch up. Stories that live in the quiet places. Stories that will find you at exactly the right moment. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. This story was for everyone who has ever been told they were not enough by someone who simply had not yet learned what enough means. You are always enough. You have always been enough. You will always be enough.